And none of this is easy, but it's critical if you want to be financially independent. You have to take a very hard look at where your money is going. And you have to potentially, and probably inevitably, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, make some very hard choices. Some of those hard choices might even be unloading that expensive house you never should have bought.
This show is dedicated to helping you strengthen your family tree and live financially free. Welcome to the Marriage, Kids, and Money podcast, everybody. This is Andy Hill, and today we're talking about FU money versus FI money. Now, while these two acronyms, they may sound the same, these are two very different financial freedom strategies. Now, to help us dive deeper into all things financial freedom, I've invited author J.L. Collins back on the show today. J.L. is the international best-selling author of The Simple Path to Wealth and has been called the Godfather of FI in the financial independence community. He launched his blog, jlcollinsnh.com, in 2011, and he's the founder of the legendary Chautauqua Financial Independence Retreats. His talk at Google has received over 1.6 million views, and he's appeared in dozens of popular finance shows and podcasts. He's also the author of the new book, Pathfinders, Extraordinary Stories of People Like You on the Quest for Financial Independence and How to Join Them. Welcome back to the show, JL.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm honored that you'd have me back. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I had such a good time with you last time, and a lot of people on our YouTube videos, they really liked it. So I'm glad to have you back and bring you back to the audience for a message about all things FU money versus FI money. Let's start with FU money. How would you define FU money?
Well, first of all, I should say that probably for most people out there, FU money and being financially independent, FI, are one and the same. But I've always thought of them as being a little bit different. And I've seen FU money as kind of the stepping stone. So FU money is when you have enough money to make bolder decisions than you would if you had to live paycheck to paycheck. Being FI means that you have enough money that work has become optional because your money is making enough money to support your needs. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Got it. So can you give us an example of FU money then? Like, let's say a good use of that. So I've developed enough FU money. Now, what does that provide me?
Well, I'll give you an example from my own young life. So when I was in my 20s, I came out of college in 1972, so now everybody knows what a geezer I am. And in 1972, it was a difficult economic time. It was the years of high inflation and stagflation. They coined the term stagflation because it was also a stagnant economy. And anyway, it took me 2 years out of college to get my first professional job. And I liked it a lot. I mean, it was hard fought to get it, and it was a job I enjoyed. I liked the people I was working for, but I also wanted to go to Europe for a year and backpack around while I was still in my 20s. And a couple of years into that job, I had managed to save the princely sum of $5,000, which in those days would have been enough to go to Europe for a year. It was, a different time. I suppose if you looked at an inflation calculator, we're probably talking about $50,000 in today's money. But anyway, I had this money, but I was on the horns of a dilemma because I didn't want to give up this job that I had, that it was hard to get and that I liked, but I also didn't want to miss the opportunity to do this backpacking thing. And I was wrestling with that when I came across a special airfare. I forget what airline was offering it, but basically, if you selected a date in the spring and a date exactly 4 months later, then you would get a special fare. And I thought, well, 4 months isn't a year, but maybe that would allow me to keep the job, right? Because in those days, I had no idea that you could negotiate this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm a young kid, right? And so I went to my boss. And I basically said, hey, I want to go to Europe for 4 months. And, any chance that there'd be a job for me when I got back? And he's like, well, no, you're not going to do that. I mean, those days things were not nearly as flexible as they are today. I envy young people today with the flexibility they have in their work, like my daughter. And again, I didn't know you could negotiate things. So I thought, okay, the answer is no. And I left his office and I thought, well, now I do have to make a decision. And so I wrestled with that for a couple of weeks, and finally I decided, I'm going to go to Europe. So I went back into his office with great reluctance, and I resigned. And he said, whoa, wait a second. Why are you quitting? And I said, well, I really want to do this European thing. And then and this was not a negotiating point on my part, because again, I didn't realize that was possible. He did something that amazed me. He said, well, hang on, don't do anything rash. Let me talk to my boss. And I'm okay. And I'm a little flabbergasted as I walk out the door. And anyway, a couple of days later, he calls me back in and he says, remember that 4-month thing you were talking about earlier? Well, if you can guarantee us you'll be back in 4 months, then we'll hold your job for you. And at that point, I realized the power of being able to step away. And it only took $5,000. And from then on, it became a lot more difficult to deal with.
That's incredible. So it did a few things there. It sounds like it gave you the confidence to have those types of conversations. And perhaps it maybe even gave your boss some ideas about his future too, about maybe saving up some money and getting that same confidence so he could make some choices in his life, right?
Yeah, but I think even more than confidence, it just made me realize that it was even a possibility, and maybe it's different today, but in those days, the way I was raised, the employer held all the cards. And, you went on bended knee and asked, and you most likely would be turned down. But this opened my eyes to the fact that, wait a second, if you're good at what you do and they want to keep you around and you can afford to play this card, because of course, there's always the chance they're going to say, well, okay, have fun. Don't let the door hit you, so you got to do it from a position of strength.
Absolutely. I'm sure that can happen too. So I think there's a couple things there. There's the saving up the money portion. There's the having the willingness to have that conversation with your employer, but also making sure you're good enough at your job that they want you to come back.
Right.
So there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. Absolutely. I love the conversation around FU money too, because it opens up doors where you maybe are feeling trapped, or you're feeling like, oh, I need this job, or the employer does have all the cards, and it sort of changes that power dynamic. Now, you did this book, Pathfinders. You had a conversation with a bunch of people about how FU money has impacted their lives. Were there any stories or maybe recent stories that you've heard that were good examples to you about how FU money has impacted people's life besides your example?
Oh, I hear the stories all the time. And some of the stories in Pathfinders, in fact, maybe most of them are about more of the reaching financial independence or being on that particular path. But, the key thing with having FU money is if you don't have that, basically you're living paycheck to paycheck. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you have no power at all. I mean, you're a gilded slave in a sense. And so until you are living on less than you earn and saving and investing the distance and building your own FU money, then the power truly does rest outside of your hands. But once you start doing that, and the more you do it, and the longer you do it, and the more capital you accumulate, well, the stronger, the scales begin to shift, and the stronger your position becomes. And the FI community is filled with stories of people who've done that in that intermediate step. As an intermediate step, which is how I think of the FU money.
I think that's great, and it's good to think about it in the terms of the steps. So let's transition that to FI money, or FI as you talk about it, financial independence. Can you define that specifically? Because I know that there are a lot of different terms for people out there, what financial independence means to them, but I know you define that specifically in the book. Could you help us with that?
Yeah, so financial independence, again, is when you have enough money that money is earning enough money to pay for all of your needs. So you are no longer required to trade your labor and your efforts for the money you need to live on. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that once you hit that magic level, you have to quit your job. I've had people say to me, I'm looking at the numbers and I'm financially independent, and that's great, but I don't want to leave my job. I love it. My reaction to that is always, well, you don't have to. I mean, financially independent doesn't mean that you have to quit your job. It just means that you have options. So if you're looking at financial independence, there's actually a mathematical formula that can guide you, because it's not simply a set dollar amount. It's a combination of what your needs are and what your resources are. So for instance, if you need $40,000 a year to meet all of your expenses and what have you, then the formula is 25 times that number. And if you multiply 25 times 40, I'll do the math for you, it's $1 million. So if you have $1 million invested in a low-cost index fund portfolio of stocks and bonds, well, then you are by definition financially independent. If you need $50,000 a year, well, then the amount of money you need is going to be 25 times that. Of course, the other way you can look at it is you can look at the amount you have. And if you're looking at your portfolio and you have $1 million, well, the Trinity study suggests that taking 4% of that a year will allow your portfolio in the vast majority of time to last at least 30 years. And that's become known as the 4% rule. I don't like to think of it as a rule because that sounds too much like a guarantee, but it's a great guideline. And so if you have $1 million, or let's say you have $500,000, well, that means that if you could live on $20,000 a year, you're there. If you need $40,000 a year, you need a little more time to build that portfolio. So you can adjust both those numbers. You can do what you can to lower your living expenses, and you can do what you can to raise the amount that you have invested. And of course, if you lower your living expenses, well, that frees up more of your income to invest. So that's a happy formula.
I think that's great. I think that's fantastic. And when we're talking about the difference between FU and FI money, with FI, what choices, I guess, what lifestyle options open up for someone when they hit FI as opposed to just having FU money?
Well, the big one is you're now in complete control of your time. So you, as I said a moment ago, if you love your job, and a lot of people do, well, you can continue doing that job. And in the back of your mind, you always know that if for whatever reason you get tired of it, you get bored, maybe the boss you love working with goes somewhere else and you get someone you're not so wild about, maybe the company changes hands and the culture changes, maybe your own interests in life change, well, you always have the option of moving on to something else. So that's the flexibility. And of course, if for whatever reason you already don't like your job, well, now you no longer have to do it. And you can either pursue a life of leisure and travel, whatever that means to you. Maybe if it's wandering around the world as a nomad, which a lot of people do, that's great. If it's going off and settling into the countryside somewhere, it's entirely up to you. But you have that option. You can even take the kind of work that doesn't really pay very well, but you find emotionally or psychologically gratifying. So it just opens up a whole range of new options. And in fact, sometimes that's a problem for people because negotiating all of this freedom and all of these potential options can be a challenge in and of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you get that time freedom, it can almost be a little paradox of what do I do with my extra time? Well, I'm so used to working. Let me do some more work, right? Or whatever it ends up being. Now, I guess we're dancing around this term of retirement a little bit, almost with FI and things like that. And I know you have strong views on the term retirement when it comes to these conversations. What are your views on the term retirement? Talk to me about that.
Well, I think people get too hung up on the word. It's just like people get hung up on the 4% rule and then go through all these convoluted processes trying to figure out, well, is 4% the right withdrawal rate, or should it be 4.8% or 3.2%? Or I mean, it's just nonsense. It's a guideline. And the same thing with retirement. I guess a classic definition of retirement is that you are no longer working for money. You might be working at hobbies or what have you, and I'm fine with that definition of it. But the other thing that I notice is that when people become financially independent and they decide to leave whatever their job was, very rarely do the kind of people who have the drive and ambition and intelligence to accomplish that, very rarely are they going to sit on a beach and do nothing for
Mhm.
decades. Almost inevitably, they're going to go out and find other things to engage themselves, to engage their minds. And equally, almost inevitably, some of those things are going to wind up throwing off money. They're going to wind up earning money. Sometimes they wind up earning more money than they did in their regular job. And then, are those people really retired? Well, what some have coined the internet retirement police march in and immediately say, no, you're not retired. You're making money doing something else. And I'm like, okay, I mean, who cares? That's why I when I look at the acronym FIRE, financial independence, retire early, I like it because it's very clever. I almost never use it myself because the retire early part just seems to make people a little bit nuts. And for me, it was never about retirement. I always liked working. I'm still working in a sense. I'm still writing books and that kind of thing. So, I don't care about whether I'm retired or not. And I tend not to think about it in those terms. And it does tend to hang people up. So you'll always hear me talk about FI or financial independence, but I don't think I've ever in my writing talked about FIRE.
Yeah, I think that's a very good conversation or a good nuance to have, because I have chatted with some authors and some researchers just about the importance of having purpose in your life as you continue throughout life. So whether that purpose is travel or helping your fellow community members or just giving back in a certain way, whatever that work is, whether you earn money for it or you don't earn money for it, it's good to have purpose, so having that way to keep yourself busy, to make sure that people are relying on you and you're having a good time and feeling like you have that purpose, it could be a good addition to your retirement, whatever you decide that retirement is, whether that's making money or not making money.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. It's, purpose is incredibly important to human beings. And a lot of times that revolves around what we typically think of as work, and work's very satisfying. I mean, you mentioned Chautauquas, the
Mm.
retreats that I created. And one of the things that I personally love about Chautauqua is I love traveling, but just traveling to a place as a tourist is much less appealing to me than traveling to someplace cool and exotic for a Chautauqua, where I get to hang out with cool people and have interesting conversations, and there's a purpose behind it. So yeah, I think purpose is incredibly important. And if you reach financial independence and say, well, I'm going to quit my job and I sure don't want to run afoul with the internet retirement police, so therefore I'm not going to let myself do anything else other than that's not, purely recreational. Well, I don't know. It sounds like a pretty miserable life.
Yes, the internet is full of opinions. Every time I look in there, there's more and more opinions. Absolutely.
Including ours.
Including ours, exactly. We're adding two more today. Absolutely. Well, one question I have for you is, a lot of people are excited about this conversation of financial independence. They get excited about what it is all about, but they get a little deflated as of late with inflation and the rising costs of home ownership. Home ownership's a big goal for a lot of people, but it seems to be escaping the grasp of a lot of Americans out there. What's your view on home ownership and just the general rising cost as it relates to a FI lifestyle?
Well, first of all, let me address inflation,
Yeah,
and then we'll talk about home ownership.
sure.
Ben Carlson, who writes A Wealth of Common Sense and is a wonderful commentator, just did a post or an article on how stocks perform in times of high inflation. And the truth is, they perform very well. It takes a little bit of time for them to catch up, but they perform very well. So for people on the simple path to wealth, which by definition means that you are saving and investing primarily, if you follow my path, in the stock market, inflation actually is going to work out pretty well for you. The people that have a problem with inflation tend to be people who don't save, who are middle class and don't save, or who are poor. Those are the people who really get hit hard by inflation. And that's something to think about when you listen to your various politicians talk about spending and that sort of thing. But just a little sidebar on that. But if you're investing and you're investing in stocks in particular, inflation, unless it really becomes, a runaway kind of thing, but sort of inflation that we've had in this country is not going to hurt you. As for home ownership, I have a reputation of being very anti-house. I mean, that comes when you write a post called "Why Your House Is a Terrible Investment." So
Oh
I
yeah.
guess that comes with the territory. But the truth is, I'm not anti-house. I've owned a house most of my adult life. But I'm anti the drumbeat that houses are an investment, let alone a good investment. Houses are a lifestyle choice. They are an expensive indulgence. And if one of your main goals is to build financial independence, to build wealth, houses tend to get in the way of that because people tend to buy too much house. And then there are a lot of ancillary expenses with houses, from taxes and repairs to almost the inevitable remodeling people do, and the furnishing and all of this kind of thing. So my advice when it comes to houses is don't buy one unless you absolutely need it, and then buy the least house that you need. That is to say, the most affordable house, so you keep your housing expenses down. Now, I have nothing against expensive indulgences. And as I say, I've owned houses most of my adult life. I have a beautiful cottage on the lake here, but it's not an investment. It's an indulgence, and it's one that I can easily afford. And that's the other point I'll make, is that you should buy anything, but especially large ticket items like cars and houses, from a position of financial strength. Where people get in trouble is where they stretch to buy something because they think they have to impress someone or for whatever reason. And if you're stretching to buy that house, you're going to be what's called house poor. If you're stretching to buy that car, you're going to have a huge car payment. And those things get in the way of being financially independent. So being financially independent is a goal. You want to tread very carefully with that kind of purchase.
Yeah, I love that. I think those are good conversations for people to think about, especially as the interest rates continue to rise. Do I actually need this? Is this something that is going to help me get to a life of financial freedom, financial independence? Obviously, if you clicked on an episode like this, maybe you're interested in financial independence. These are the steps we're talking about. Let's talk to the person who's listening. They're saying, "Okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, JL. And I am living paycheck to paycheck, but I want more financial freedom in my life." What is one step they should take following this interview to pursue that simple path?
Well, so first of all, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, almost by definition, you become a victim of lifestyle inflation, right? So you come out of school and you start working and you're making whatever you're working. And then as you get raises, you keep spending more and more money. And if God forbid you're borrowing money to have an even bigger lifestyle, now you have debt on top of that. So yeah, let's start with the debt. If you have debt, that's a major problem. You have to get rid of that before you can begin to think about wealth. And in our culture, for some reason, we've convinced people that having debt is normal, that it's natural, that it's acceptable. And it's not. To me, it's like being covered with blood sucking leeches, because that's what your debts are. They are sucking your financial blood. So what I tell people is, you just got to take out your sharpest knife and start scraping those little suckers off. And there's nothing easy about that. It simply means you have to stop spending money to free up money to pay down the debt. Now, once you pay down the debt, or if you're fortunate enough that you don't have debt, you're just living paycheck to paycheck, you still have to go through that process of altering your spending so that you are spending less than you are taking in. So you have to, none of this is easy, but it's critical if you want to be financially independent. You have to take a very hard look at where your money is going. And you have to potentially, and probably inevitably, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, make some very hard choices. Some of those hard choices might even be unloading that expensive house you never should have bought, or unloading that expensive car payment you never should have taken on, and driving something much cheaper. and living in something much less expensive until you get your feet under you. And again, when you can afford those kinds of things, those expensive indulgences, by all means, I have no problem with those. I do that myself. But you've got to get to financial independence first.
Yeah, some of those hard choices might be the best choices that you make for yourself in the long run. Absolutely. JL, you've got this great new book, Pathfinders. Tell us a little bit about it and where people can get it.
So Pathfinders came about because when The Simple Path to Wealth came out in 2016, almost immediately I started receiving stories from people telling me about their unique situation and how they were adapting the principles in the book to their goals and their life and walking the path. And that was remarkable to me for a couple of reasons. I wrote The Simple Path to Wealth for my daughter. I think that's one of the reasons it's resonated so well with a lot of people, although I didn't think about this strategically at the time. But this is exactly what I tell my own child to do. But she was in college at the time, and she's an American. So this is a very U.S.-centric book, and it is a book that kind of assumes that you're at the beginning of your journey. Well, as your last question indicated, what about somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck? Not everybody is at the beginning of their journey. Some people have succumbed to lifestyle inflation, and they have this kind of stuff that they have to unwind. There are people from all over the world who are following The Simple Path to Wealth. And again, it's a very U.S.-centric book. Those people are able to look beyond the conversations I have about 401ks and IRAs, which are U.S.-based things, and say, well, how does this apply to my country? And what are the equivalents in my country? The same token, people look at this book that was written for my daughter at the beginning of her journey and saying, well, okay, I'm not at the beginning of my journey, but how do these principles apply to me? And I've just been amazed and thrilled at the kinds of stories I have heard. So for years now, I wanted to collect these and share them with a broader audience. And that's what Pathfinders is. There's about 100 of these little stories in it, and it's broken down into 9 sections, from things talking about freedom and debt and lifestyle inflation, for that matter, and also the end game, what to do when you finally reached it. So there's 9 different sections, and I have little introductions and comments about the lessons learned in those sections, and then there are the stories. And the other thing that I love about this book is some of these stories come from there's one who was a child migrant worker when he was young. I mean, picking fruits and vegetables, it's not the kind of start you would think is going to lead to financial independence, but it did. There's another person who tells the story of their childhood where his idea of somebody rich was the person who had the flush toilet where they lived. So I love those stories, because one of the jabs that is taken at the financial independence movement is, it's only for, certain kinds of privileged people who have tech jobs and get paid a lot of money. And well, there are stories actually about, there's a story that comes to mind as I'm telling this about a couple that worked in Silicon Valley and had those high-paying tech jobs and did a little geo arbitrage when they moved back to their home state of Ohio. So there's both kinds of stories, but I think I love the ones of people coming from the most humble of beginnings, because it puts the lie to this idea that this is only a path for certain kinds of people. And as I say, if you read Pathfinders, you should be aware that you are never again going to be able to say, I can't do this. This is not for me. Because I can almost guarantee anybody listening to this, there are stories in this book of people who have done it, who started with less than you probably are going to start with. Now, you can still, of course, choose not to follow the path, and most people do. Most people are going to look at their lifestyle that's inflated and look at the kinds of changes they're going to have to make, and they're going to say, I don't really want to do that. And that's fine. It's their money. It's their choice. to walk this path, you have to decide that the top financial priority is to be financially independent. If your top financial priority is to live in the fancy house or to drive the fancy car, that's your call. But you're probably not going to be able to be financially independent at the same time.
These are choices we get to make, and I do love that about the book. I do love that there are so many different perspectives of how to walk your version of financial independence and the multiple backgrounds that you'll see people come from. You guys can find that, Pathfinders. It's a fantastic new book. I've had a chance to read it. And JL, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, hey, it's been entirely my pleasure, Andy. I appreciate you having me back on the show, and I hope we do this again sometime.